what we say to our partners is, 99.9% of digitally stored data out there is unclassified. It's commercial. And so if we're going to rely just on our classified information for our early warning, like we're ignoring the vast majority of the information the world is telling us. And it's an obvious point, but one that I think isn't always appreciated, because if you think about the history of these organizations since the National Security Act of 1947, government has always been the leader in technology and information gathering. Right? And there's a real muscle memory to say, hey, we know best. We have all the stuff.
Right. Hey, everyone, and thanks for listening to another episode of DIB Innovators. Today, I'm speaking with Semwangu, CEO and founder of Bazze. Sammy, thanks for chatting with me today.
Awesome, Dave. Thanks for having me.
No, I think this is great. A lot of challenges with data, intelligence community, lots of changes in the government. So you're right in the middle of that, and this would be fun. But before we get into that, how did you get to, found Bazze? What was the story, the origin story that brought you to this place in your life?
Yeah, it was an indirect path. I never saw myself growing up as an entrepreneur or a business owner. I was not like in third grade, selling something to begin my story as an entrepreneur by any stretch of imagination. But the long story short, I spent about 10 years in the national security community. And after that, I founded my first company. It didn't go the way I hoped, to say the least. I think I made every mistake possible, 3 times at least. I learned a lot. And most importantly, after that, I had a tremendous opportunity to work at Red Owl as a sales engineer to really get smart. Once you leave government, as I'm sure you can appreciate, you need to prove yourself to the outside world that you can be like a useful, you can be part of the P&L and be a useful member of the team. And so at Red Owl, I was a sales engineer, and that helped me kind of get into the Silicon Valley game. It helped me become more technical, understanding the underpinnings of AWS and Elastic and all these wonderful things that were coming out and making these companies ever more innovative. And the third part, really expanding my network of really smart folks doing interesting things outside government. And after Red Owl was acquired, and I went back out there to start Bazze. And what I saw in 2019 was that many of the things that our defense and intelligence community was doing in the early 2000s, in the 2010, 2012 era, was now available in the commercial space. So you think about sensors that the government was launching, operations that its operatives were conducting to collect data and gain insight about the world. Now you could essentially go online and buy that data. And so we said, given that the US and her allies are responsible for knowing everything at all times, we should be reorienting how we do our business. And in fact, leveraging the data that's already out there before we dedicate our precious resources in government to collecting more information. And so that's often referred to as OSINT, or again, commercially collected data. And so from there, we created a platform. And the takeaway is, it enables our customers to ask a question, which we then federate out to now 24 plus commercial data vendors. And then within a matter of a few minutes, if not a few seconds, we're generating an exquisite insight for our customers to integrate into their workflow. So it's a tremendous efficiency gain of understanding what's going on in the world, getting an insight back, and paying only for the data that they use. And so we started that in 2019 with a phase 2 sitter, and it's been an adventure ever since.
I'm sure. Well, that's fantastic. And it is interesting, and to transition out of the government and then get into the commercial sector. And to take a job like a sales engineer, which a lot of people are like, oh, it's almost like an entry-level job, Mm-hmm. But to have the humility to do it, and also the foresight to go, I need to get that. I see a lot of folks that transition out, myself included, that, really kind of overvalued. There's a lot of great experience from the, government service, but it doesn't necessarily apply until you get domain experience and understand, this inside. So that, applaud you for that. That sounds like it worked out fantastic. Can you give me a use case then? So as you guys go out and you're doing this, like what would be like a question that might be used, and how would they interact with your platform, or what type of info would they get back?
Yeah, so I'll kind of give you an idea of what the status quo is, and then when using Bazze, kind of what happens. So let's think of a big area, kind of North Africa for the sake of example. When we're trying to understand what's going on the ground, we'll fly a drone or a plane, something very expensive, to burn holes in the sky and try to get an idea of who's who in the zoo. With commercial data, what you can ask those same questions. Hey, who's on the ground? What are they doing? Where they come from? Where are they going? Before you ever send that plane or that asset out to go look. So instead of flying the plane out to do circles, you actually leverage the commercial data. That could be cell phone location data. It could be existing satellite imagery data collected by again, the proliferation of commercial data vendors. See what they understand about the world, and then you're just flying that drone exactly to the spot it needs to go to answer the last 10, 20% of what we need to understand. And that's an example of how starting your analytical workflow with commercially available data enables you to really maximize the utilization of the government resources in the most effective way possible. Now, a lot of folks understand that commercial data is valuable. Now, it's not enough to say, hey, commercial data is valuable. Let's go buy all the data, ingest it to the high side, and store it in a very safe place. It's just not sustainable. Buying entire data sets. Pretty soon you're in the tens of millions of dollars, and you're storing and processing lots of data that ultimately you're never going to use. And so what makes Bazze unique is that we have essentially a super API, if you will, where you submit a query to us saying, tell me about this place in the world, tell me more about this telephone number or this email, whatever the case may be. And then we federate it or send it out to all the data vendors that are on our platform. They respond with what they know. Our automated analytical engine will send subsequent queries to kind of fill out the profile about your question, and then return that back to you. So the value is, if you only have $50,000 or $100,000 or $1 million, you're not using that to acquire entire data sets. You're using that through Bazze to acquire just the relevant data for your mission. And so you have access to the global holdings of all these data vendors, but you're only pulling back and storing the data that's relevant to what you need.
Yeah, there's a lot to that. I mean, that sounds fantastic. It seems like there needs to be a lot of trust. So between you and your customer, because are you actually getting good data? Garbage in equals garbage out.
Exactly.
And then how did you get, so talk to me a little bit about that, but tied in with how did you get partners to work with you? Because I imagine there are just a ton of partners that have this information that are giving you very sensitive data. How did that, building that partner ecosystem look as you began this journey, and getting them, the customers, to trust what you were giving them was useful and accurate?
Yeah. At the heart of, we are an intelligence targeting early warning platform. At the heart of it is really a two-sided marketplace. We got our first customer was actually a close friend and a former student of mine. And we sat, his team and our team sat in a conference room. I think this is kind of an example of government partnering with commercial entities to say, let's be awesome together. And we sketched out, on a whiteboard, hey, how will this all, how could we send you a question and you give us an answer back in a matter of just a few minutes, if not a few seconds? It was awesome. And the takeaway is we developed a product that was ultimately deployed to the field within 2 months and used in meaningful operations. And we're incredibly proud of that. So say on the buy side, the customer side, that was really leveraging our team's close relationship with folks in government and finding folks who were just really forward leaning and wanting to do the necessary as fast as possible. On the data partner side, it was a relatively straightforward sell. Our pitch is, hey, we're really good at establishing contracts with this very hard market, defense and intelligence community. Connect your API to our platform, and every time you get queried, you get paid. And by the way, our customers are spending millions of dollars per year and running thousands of queries per day. So your cost of customer acquisition drops dramatically because, if they themselves are trying to sell these organizations, anyone who's worked with government knows that can be a very long process. That can be a 6-month to multi-year process just to sell one data source. And so by partnering with Bazze, they say, oh, wow, they're working across the U.S. national security and defense community, as well as the Brits and the Aussies and elsewhere in NATO. So through Bazze, we can now sell to all these different places because we've got great data, and we're paid on a per query basis. And so that pitch I think our data partners find compelling. And currently we've got 24 plus, and we'll be at 50 vendors in the very near future.
That's awesome. It seems like you figured out that, so you look at, lately defense tech is spinning up, now there's actually capital going to it. But the idea of how do you take innovation, commercial innovation, quickly transfer it to a use case or be useful for, the government side, and have that deployed. Sounds like you kind of nailed this. Is this now like an ongoing thing? You guys should be successful. You get a great use case, a great customer. You've proven your value set. Talk to me about that journey of what it's like then to continue and actually get this where it's being utilized across the entire industry sector.
Our product is not just a great tool, but we ultimately envision ourselves as the ultimate distribution mechanism for commercial data into government, ultimately into the commercial sector. We got started in 2019 with a phase 2 SBIR, as I talked about. It started with my good friend, and that was its own adventure, needless to say. But where things really took off was the war in Ukraine, where we saw how commercially available data in the form of satellite collection and cell phone location data and other kind of telecommunications data, when paired with relatively affordable commercial platforms like drones, when that was combined, as you saw, taking out helicopters and armored personnel carriers and tanks, at will, if you will. And so we were able to have conversations with our customers and say, hey, look at the real world. What we're talking about is not just, an abstraction. It's something that, we can all look at and say, hey, this is the future. This is not just the future. This is the current of warfare. And we need to move with the speed to meet those demands. And so from that point in time, conversations with our customers became much easier. And that enabled us to not only work with great partners here in the United States, but again, also in the UK and Australia, so across AUKUS. And we continue to expand into our NATO and East Asian allies. And so it's an incredibly exciting time as all these nations are investing in their own defense and realizing that every military and intelligence unit will now be starting their workflow with commercial data. And then whatever it can't be answered by commercial data, then they'll be using their precious resources to close the last mile. And so we're really excited to be part of that market movement and really to be the leader in that effort.
It's great. Do you find that the adoption of this tech is, it sounds like the understanding of the capability set, but just across the board in government, adoption of, innovative tech is accepted, utilized, maximized?
It varies. We have, let's just say the US government is such a massive enterprise. And so you'll find folks who are moving out very quickly and adopting, whether it's commercial data or other types of tools that this emerging defense industrial base from Silicon Valley and elsewhere are providing. And there are other parts that are just very slow. And that's just the nature of the beast. I think what we do find is our allies are moving a bit faster than we are because they don't have as much money. So they have to be more realistic about they are more precious of their resources, admittedly, and they're in the splash zone, right? They're much closer to, let's be real, Russia and China. And so they don't have the same sort of comfort that we have here in the US as a continental-sized country surrounded by water. And so we do see them moving out with speed. Within the US, we're seeing progress, but it's not really fast enough. And I'm happy to talk about kind of why that's the case, but that's certainly my, anecdotally what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I think we got many listeners and other guests who have dealt with this. What is your perspective on it? Like, why is it so slow? I mean, we've got Doge coming in, and different ways to make things more efficient and spend dollars more wisely. Are these making difference, or is there just a fundamental issue you see at play?
Yeah, so it's crawl, walk, run. And so the Air Force did a wonderful thing in really opening up the spigot, the aperture, if you will, for exciting companies who want to work with government with the expansion of AFWorks and the SBIRs and the open topics, sort of 2017, 2018. As is well known, many of those SBIRs, including our own, did not transition to an enduring effort, whether that's as a subcontractor or a program of record or however one wants to quantify it. And the reason is because the rest of the machine did not change. We provide a lot more R&D funding, but the actual kind of O&M kind of ongoing funding has not changed. And to date, I think roughly 1% of the defense budget is dedicated to the most innovative companies coming in and trying to solve the biggest problems facing our national security community, from both kind of the warfighter to the core kind of internal operations that make our fighting force the most powerful in the world. And to me, I think that the proliferation of innovative offices is kind of window dressing for the core fact that employees of the defense and community are not really incentivized to try new stuff. And that if we in fact want to bring in new capabilities across the board, not just the high-end stuff for SOCOM and CIA and NSA, but for big Army, big Navy, big Air Force, and the Marines. We need to enable the workforce to try new things and be rewarded for that. And so, for example, in the intelligence community, you're incentivized not to fill an intelligence gap, but oftentimes just to run secret operations. And so in our case, to answer your question on how are people adopting it, when we come with an exquisite capability for intelligence, but it's completely unclassified, it's not secret, well, that's not aligned with how they're promoted. And so you can see how people have much less kind of energy to try new things when it's not aligned with what they're trying to do. And so we can, you can feel kind of pushing a boulder up a hill, because at the heart of it, folks don't see what's in it for me. And I think these organizations throughout the Defense Department and the IC have the authorities to reorient how to incentivize its workforce. And until we do so, I think we'll struggle to realize the goals we have for our national security community.
Well, and people cycle out, right? The people on the government side are cycling out every 18 months, 2 years.
Well, again, as we were talking about before, we hopped on, like you were looking at a future of moving like every, 4 years, in 4 years, moving 4 times. And that is, in the modern era, that is a very difficult thing to do with kids and family and so on and so forth. So I think we all know that the way we manage people in government is essentially a post-World War II way of doing things. And with many assumptions baked into how families and how people live their lives that aren't really relevant, or in large part aren't really relevant to people today. And so, for example, when we were doing our SBIR phase 2, we developed the product, we deploy it, it does what it says on the tin. We brief it up to the 2-star. She says, hey, this is great. I think we're off to the races. Our champions at the most important point of the budgetary cycle, PCS or rotate elsewhere in the command. Not because they wanted to leave, but that's just how the machine works. And so with their departure, so did all the momentum of our work with the customer. And their replacement, great American, there was no incentive for him to kind of continue carrying the water for his predecessors. And so it all kind of died on the vine. And, to that point, our champions were only in that position for 2 years. So if you think about it, you move into it, anyone who's moved to home, particularly with family, like the first 6 months are just trying to keep the train on the tracks, right? And the last 6 months, you're already preparing for, how do we get situated in the new place that we're headed to? So of that 2-year period, there's only really a year to 14 months where that person is effective and knowledgeable about what's going on. And so that, in addition to how we reward people and how we manage them, until we modernize that, we will continue to lag on innovation, because I think that is really the substrate with which you're able to actually effectively bring on new technologies and new capabilities.
All right, so you're the head of DOGE taking care of this problem. Organizational dynamics, incentivization. Big picture, if you just kind of throw down, like, here's what would need to happen, from your perspective, seeing it now on both sides, what would enable, what would the incentivization be? How would you get this across? How would you organize that?
Well, different functions in an organization have different incentives, right? And so let's just say they kept the most effective people in an organization. They would still be operating within what I think is an antiquated way to manage people and incentivize their performance. So we won't see the desired efficiency. And so to answer your question, I think this is trite, but the incentives have to be directly aligned to the mission of the organization. So I talked about in the intelligence world, incentives shouldn't be around conducting secret operations. We should be incented around actually filling an intelligence gap. And so in that regard, so the officer won't care whether it's classified, data, or it's commercially available. All that matters is that it fills that gap. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's just one example. It's going to vary throughout each organization and in different parts of a given organization. But, really working backwards and saying, hey, what is the true mission of the organization, and therefore, how do we enable our folks to do exactly that?
Interesting. Yeah, that would be an interesting way to break it apart, but also very challenging, as we'll see.
To be honest, the points I'm making are ones that have been discussed ad nauseum for many years. So I'm not particularly breaking new ground. And I think anyone who's been a part of the machine, whether it's in the defense or in the IC, will be like, oh yeah, I know what that conversation is about.
Right. So how then do you see, crossing the valley of death? Like for you guys, like what's your plan then to navigate with this disincentivization from your customer to get across? So what's kind of your plan there?
For us, we were in so there's multiple valleys, right? And so when we had the SBR phase 2, and that came to naught, it was really painful because we had invested all of our sales efforts into that transitioning into an ongoing effort. And so when it didn't, we had hired a team, we'd ramped up our spend, and then everything kind of fell off a cliff. And that was really difficult. What I learned from that was that partnerships are critical and expanding our opportunity to sell throughout the government. And so we obviously work directly with government customers, but also with product and services firms who are already embedded with our target end users. So think of like a Palantir or a Valinavar or a Deloitte. If they're working with our target end users, we provide a unique capability to access the ever-expanding world of commercial data on a pay-as-you-go basis. And so that's how we ultimately grew our pipeline and found the success we've had today. I think for us, ultimately, was we knew the problem. And the U.S. government, this is from the doctrine, but they want to create this all-domain sensing and sense-making capability that moves at machine speed. And so if we think about that, well, how are we going to do it? It can't just be classified data, so it has to be commercial. So, okay, great, we've got commercial and classified data working together. Well, we can't put the internet on the high side. It's not sustainable. So we have to query the data where it sits. And so with those kind of core insights that we have to use commercial data and we have to query the data where it sits, we knew, and we know, our approach is ultimately where the ball is going, the puck is going to go. And so we built the platform. And because we're asset light, we're not spending lots of money when we don't have lots of income, right? Our expenses move with our income. And so it enabled us to persist as we were going through this very lengthy sales cycle. And then ultimately, with the events in Ukraine and the market turning, and we could point to say, hey, this is a real world application of what we're talking about, our sales cycle became a lot easier. And so, to answer your question, we're overcoming a lot of those initial challenges just because the problem is becoming so acute and our solution for it is becoming so obvious.
You mentioned they're working with, let's say large primes or partners like that. Was there any fear of, I've heard this before, of, well, if we go in there, they're just going to take our tech, they just buy us for cheap, or they're just going to develop this technology because it's not like this problem is known there. Were the concerns about that? Have you seen like people, as you work together, because oftentimes I feel like that's an over worried about topic of someone stealing something you've got. Definitely exists, but how do you think about that and those type of partners?
I feel this intimately, this question. So when we started in 2019, we were approached by a large prime, and I had that fear. I was like, hey, you guys are going to steal my opportunity, steal my idea.
Yeah.
Get away from me. And so we persisted, directly with the customer, and that was all we did. What happened was we were so focused on the customer, we didn't build the pipeline to sell to elsewhere. And so when we lost the phase 2, we're like, oh man, we don't have many at bats.
Other slips.
Exactly. And through that process, we learned that if you're building a truly unique product, these large primes, they're not going to be able to copy it. Someone shouldn't be able to just see your thing and copy it and run with it, right? On just the idea alone, however obvious. And so we really shouldn't be so precious about partnering with the rest of the ecosystem. Another part is, even when you get a sale, it's really hard to stay close to the customer. They work in windowless rooms, in giant buildings, surrounded by, a moat of cars and barbed wire. And so by partnering with larger defense services and product companies, you get leverage to both sell more and just as importantly, stay close to the customer. Understand what value are they getting from your product. What problems are they having, so you can see around a corner and get ahead of things. And we have found that when we work with a product or services company and we have complementary capabilities, 1 + 1 = 3 in that regard.
Yeah, it is a common fear, but to your point, partnerships is what's going to really help, emerging tech get to the customer at a reasonable rate and reasonable speed. Talk to me about AI, overused term, very much discussed, obviously with huge data sources like I imagine you have, or being able to work with that. How have you incorporated, AI, machine learning, automation into your platform, and how do you see that in your space continuing to grow?
Like the rest of the world, it's a massive accelerant that evolves so quickly. It's hard to kind of fathom, where it'll take us. We incorporate AI in every element of our product. A customer says, "Hey, I want to find out, more about this company or more about, this military," and we're able to take that problem statement, translate that into a query, and then generate an insight, not just vomiting, lots of data in return, in just a few moments. So you're able to, an untrained analyst is able to do more in, 5 minutes today than an experienced analyst can do, was able to do in an entire day or even a week. And so that's just an example of how we see, the integration of LLMs and everything around that within our product.
As you look in this space, are there emerging technology in and around what you're doing that, you think is going to be important that's being ignored by, the customer set, the government customer set?
Hard to say because, again, the customer set is so large and different folks have different appetites for new technology, so on and so forth. I'd say this, we have amazing customers who want to use necessary, want to be effective, whose hearts are open to trying all these new things. I just think that oftentimes they're constrained within the system within which they're operating, right? And to the extent that they may not be taking full advantage of emerging technologies or capabilities, there's a massive value unlock. And again, saying or empowering them to, in fact, try new stuff without having to have every answer and every bit of risk, answered for on day one. So, for example, we were trying to kickstart our phase 2 with a customer about 1.5 years ago. And on day one, they're like, "Hey, this is a great capability, but how do we scale this across the force?" I was just like, "Hey, the force is like 30,000 people. Like,
Right.
Trust me, I want to scale to the force. I am fully on board. That is, fantastic. Your lips are God's ears." But again, just like training, crawl, walk, run. Let's get it in the system. Let's validate that it's doing what we need it to do. And then we can approach, we can certainly talk about and have a plan, but let's not make that the gating factor on day one. And I think that's an example of how the incentive structure can constrict the thinking or the opportunities on both sides of the equation, whether you're a company selling it or a mission owner trying to do what your people need you to do.
Yeah, it is definitely an interesting challenge. You hear that a lot, though. Yeah. How do I scale this for everyone? What?
It's just not how the rest of the world works. And it's not even how the government works. Again, you go through training. They don't just put you in a plane and say, "Fly with it." You sit down, you do some schoolwork, and then you go, you train with a co-pilot, and then so on and so forth. And so this is not a new thing to government. We just have to, make sure we're applying that throughout all the things that we're doing.
Yeah, I got selected for pilot training. They're like, "So how are you I just want to make sure you're going to be able to run a large mission commander mission with, 100 different aircraft against 2 countries." Like, where's the airplane? What is an airplane?
Exactly.
Yeah, it is pretty fascinating with that. Well, in your, what do you think, as you've had this experience, both your past experience as well as currently, and just kind of in the global dynamics that are shifting, what early warning signals do you think, our ICs miss, when monitoring kind of emerging global threats? Is there like a common thread, and is it being aware of the commercial information that's out there, or is there anything you could, summarize into that?
What we say to our partners is, 99.9% of digitally stored data out there is unclassified. It's commercial. And so if we're going to rely just on our classified information for our early warning, like, we're ignoring the vast, vast majority of the information the world is telling us. And it's an obvious point, but one that I think isn't always appreciated, because if you think about the history of these organizations since the National Security Act of 1947, government has always been the leader in technology and information gathering. Right? And there's a real muscle memory to say, hey, we know best. We have all the stuff.
Right.
And as we all know, technology development is, from the 80s, more or less, has been way faster on the outside than it has been on the inside. And that trend is only accelerating, as evidenced by the development of AI. And yet, these organizations, I think they intellectually know that's the case, but spiritually, it hasn't really caught up. The strength of these organizations is, in fact, their esprit de corps, like this, that togetherness, kind of closing ranks. But at the sometimes it can be a bit of a tragic flaw in that esprit de corps can sometimes blind us to some of the changing dynamics in the outside world. And so I think if we, we Americans, the U.S. government, do not use all the information that the world is telling us, we're at tremendous risk of missing the next big one. And that obviously would be a tragedy, right? And so we, that's the story we tell, and we want to make sure that we get ahead of things so that we reduce to the greatest extent possible something from happening.
Yeah, it is an interesting dilemma in using that. Well, let's say, for your company then, to become the premier collection and product that delivers intelligence, unclassified intelligence that's meaningful. How are you going to get there from like a financing? Did you start off bootstrapping this? How did you take care of kind of the economics behind starting a company and how you're going to scale it?
Yeah, so we started the company before a friend of mine said before defense was fetch, before all the cool kids were doing it. Not because just because we did it because we thought it was cool. We thought we could do something really meaningful. As a result, we grew based off of the money that was available to us to be an SBIR and early contract. So you're never just bootstrapping or just venture backed. You kind of flow between the two as needs dictate. And so the takeaway is we started off bootstrap, and then we raised an institutional round in 2023 to enable us to deliver for our expanding customer set in both the U.S. and abroad. And what's really exciting now is as we've really bedded in with those original customers, we're growing quite quickly and hiring a core engineering team here in San Francisco to work in person most days of the week, and then hiring 4 deployed teams in DC area, in London, in Canberra, in the very near future. And so we're going out raising our Series A, and we've had fantastic conversations, and well on our way to closing that and making real this vision for providing the U.S. and her allies the insights they need to support their missions, and ultimately, deliver on the expectations that the U.S. people and kind of the West in general expect of their governments.
Well, this has been great. I mean, and what a great journey. Best of luck in your Series A, and I hope listeners, I hope other folks can process, kind of your message. I mean, it is important. How do we maximize the intelligence that's out there and make it super useful so that we can put our dollars, our national resources to the best use when protecting our country and, the United States and our allies. So,
and it's our people. We need to incentivize our people to be effective. The technology will follow, but we need the right incentives, and we need to manage them in the best way possible.
Absolutely. So, fantastic. If people want to follow you and keep track, how would they do that best?
We're hiring. And so if you're excited about our mission and you want to do good, please reach out to me on LinkedIn, Samuel Semwangu. You'll be able to find me, or search Bazze. Send me a note about what kind of role you want to do and how you think you could be effective, and we'd love to have the conversation. Similarly, you can contact us through our website at bazze.io. So yeah, more to come.
Awesome. Well, Sammy, thank you so much. It's been a blast, and I look forward to watching you guys become that dominant force in the intelligence world.
Thank you, David. It's great to chat with you.